questions about how to file your comments or anything else related to consumer advocate, I'll be available then to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Additionally, you should have also had a thin white piece of paper on your way in that has the Office of Consumer Advocate's general overview as well as contact information should you wish to contact them. Additionally, Ms. Ryan will be here during the question and answer period if you have any questions relating to OCA. Okay, permit process. I will now go over the hazardous liquid permit process and law, including the legal rights of landowners. A permit is a grant of authority by the IUB to build, operate, and maintain a pipeline. Information on the permit process and law, as well as your legal rights, are included in your informational packet. The first step in the permit process is for the company to request informational meetings be scheduled in the counties where the pipeline is proposed to be located. A requirement for notification of the informational meeting is that Navigator identify the corridor within which the company wishes to place the pipeline. Notice is provided to all property owners within the corridor. Therefore, in many cases, a landowner may have received notice to attend today's informational meeting because their property is within the corridor, but not part of the proposed pipeline route. An informational meeting is scheduled in 36 counties. There will also be a virtual meeting on January 19th, 2022 at 6 p.m. So if you know anyone who wasn't able to make it here today for this meeting, I would ask that you recommend and tell them about the virtual option that will be on in January. The information on how to join and attend that virtual option is on the IUB's website. Navigator cannot begin to negotiate any easement with landowners until the informational meeting for their county has been completed. The route may change within the proposed corridor, and I recommend that you follow the proceeding in the docket in the IUB's electronic filing system. The company cannot file the petition for permit with the IUB until at least 30 days after the informational meetings have been held. After the petition is filed, the IUB will set a scheduling conference that establishes a schedule for intervention by parties, which could be landowners, testimony, and a hearing date. Notice of the hearing will be published for 2 consecutive weeks in the affected county. At the hearing, the IUB will hear evidence in favor of or opposing the project. Any affected landowner may file comments either for or against the proposed pipeline as part of the IUB's review process. Phone calls or verbal communication will not be considered as part of the official record. Only written comments will be considered. So as Ms. Ryan stated, nothing here said today will be considered as part of the official record. So if you would like your comments to be a part of that record, you will need to submit a comment on the docket number in the EFS. If you do file comments, please reference the docket number identified in your packet, which is HLP-2021-0003. As this will help us know what docket or project you are referring to. This docket number can be found on the front page of your informational packet. Comments may be filed at any time in the docket. Information on how to file a comment is one of the sheets in your informational packet. Easement agreements. An easement agreement is a legal agreement that allows one person to use another person's property in certain specified ways. An easement provides rights to a company to locate its property on someone else's private property. It does not transfer ownership of the property. Landowners may contact an attorney or receive assistance from family members or friends during negotiation of the easement terms. Landowners may negotiate the use of their land or specify their desire for placement of the facilities on their land as they negotiate. Landowners have the right to ask for the pipeline to be moved to a different location. An easement may be either voluntarily granted or obtained through the use of eminent domain. Prior to obtaining an easement, the company may enter on land for surveying purposes after giving 10 days written notice to the landowner. The company must pay for any damage resulting from surveying. What is eminent domain or condemnation? The right of eminent domain may only be granted by the IUB after a public hearing. Notice of the IUB hearing will be sent by the company through certified mail to landowners and parties in possession of property for which eminent domain is requested. If the IUB grants eminent domain, the company may obtain easement rights after a compensation proceeding. The County Compensation Commission under Iowa Code 6B determines just compensation for property rights taken by eminent domain. So, this amount is not determined by the IUB, but by the County Compensation Commission. Frequently asked questions about eminent domain are included in your packet. Statement of property owner's rights. Included in your information packet is a green sheet that has a statement of property owner's rights put together by the Iowa Attorney General's Office. There are 12 property rights included in Chapter 34 of the Attorney General's Administrative Rules. These rights apply to owners of record who may have property acquired by condemnation and come from Iowa Code Chapters 6A, 6B, and 316. If you have a pen with you, I would ask that you get it out now and circle the following numbers on that green sheet. Number 1, 5, 6, and 10. Again, number 1, 5, 6, and 10. If an easement on a property is condemned, right number 1 would apply, and rights 5, 6, and 10 could apply. These rights address procedures in condemnation taken by the court-appointed Compensation Commission in determining the amount to be paid to the landowner. Please review and read this sheet as it is very important because it explains your legal rights. The IUB has adopted rules regarding the restoration of agricultural land during and after pipeline construction in 199 Iowa Administrative Code, Chapter 9. A copy of Chapter 9 is included in your packet. The company will be required to submit a land restoration plan when it files its petition. The plan must comply with the requirements set out in Chapter 9. Landowners will be able to view the plan in the IUB's filing system and file comments regarding the plan. As part of its decision in this case, the IUB may approve or require modification to the land restoration plan. The IUB may impose additional land restoration requirements based on specific details of the project. Landowners can negotiate their own restoration agreements with the company, but the terms must be consistent with board rules at Chapter 9 and be in writing. Landowner comments regarding land restoration may be filed using the IUB's comment form. The County Board of Supervisors will appoint a county inspector to inspect the construction of the pipeline for compliance with the approved restoration plan or with any negotiated restoration agreement. And it sounds like O'Brien County has hired ISG to be the inspector for this project. So O'Brien County has already gotten a inspector. The company is required to provide the name of the county inspector to all affected landowners prior to the commencement of construction. The county inspector may temporarily halt construction if the company is not in compliance with the land restoration plan. If the company continues to violate the land restoration plan, the County Board of Supervisors may petition the IUB for corrective action and civil penalties. Damages. The company is required to pay actual property damage caused by construction or maintenance of this proposed hazardous liquid pipeline. Damages are considered different and separate from easement payments. The company is required to designate a person to receive inquiries or damage claims from landowners. Damage claims are received and decided by a county compensation commission after the County Board of Supervisors has declared construction to be complete. The company may include a provision in the easement agreement addressing damage settlement procedures. Hazardous liquid pipelines are inspected by the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, also known as PHMSA. For more information about PHMSA and its inspection procedures, you can visit phmsa.dot.gov. Finally, on the screen is the IUB's contact information. It should also be in your packet, but if you have any questions or are having trouble filing something, we have a wonderful customer service department at the IUB, and you can call them and they will help answer your questions and can also help you with filing in the EFS system. With that, before I turn the microphone over to Navigator personnel, I will quickly explain what will take place next. While Navigator makes its presentation, I will follow the IUB's checklist to determine whether the presentation made by the petitioner, Navigator, has provided you, the landowner, or interested party with the information you would require to make an informed decision about the project. The checklist that I'm using is based upon both Iowa statute and IUB rules governing hazardous liquid pipelines in Iowa. If there are unanswered questions or areas where I believe additional information is required, I will require Navigator to answer those questions. If Navigator is unable to answer the questions here, I will require the company to file the information in the IUB's electronic filing system under the docket previously identified HLP 2021-0003. When I've determined that the petitioner Navigator has answered our questions, we will take questions from you, the audience. Navigator will now introduce its personnel and make its presentation. Again, please hold your questions about the project until after the completion of their presentation.
Good afternoon. I almost said morning. It's a little dark in here. My name is Elizabeth Burns-Thompson. I'm here on behalf of Navigator. It's really nice to see a couple familiar faces here in the audience today. I'm originally from Iowa, live here in Iowa. My folks actually farm on the eastern side of the state. I've spent all of my career in agriculture, actually worked with a handful of you over the years with a number of the ag commodity groups, as well as the biofuel space in both the ethanol and the biodiesel space prior to jumping onto the team here at Navigator. So as a farm kid myself, I'm really excited about what this project means for the potential for the ag industry that most of you all in this room depend on, as well as myself. So we will jump right into it. As you can tell, this agenda, we've got a lot to cover today. What I will say is this particular slide deck has been filed with the Utilities Board already. So the docket number that was mentioned a couple times prior, if you ever want to reference any of these materials, that's available on that docket, so you can see all of that on that site as well. Additionally, there are a couple charts on here that are going to be somewhat difficult to see on the screens. We've taken the opportunity to blow a couple of those up on posters off to the side here, so encourage you after the meeting, or maybe some of you did before, take a point to look at a couple of those charts in a little more detail. We will jump right into it. I believe it's important to put faces with names, and so these are the faces associated with Navigator CO2. You'll have the opportunity to interact with a number of them throughout the lifeline of the project, and I have a couple of my teammates here with me today, Steve, our head of engineering, and Monica with permitting, and they'll help me with some of our Q&A here as we get to that stage of the program. So as I mentioned, we are Navigator CO2. The project we are proposing today is the Heartland Greenway. Our team collectively has a long track record of projects like this, both successfully and safely constructing as well as operating midstream infrastructure, midstream being pipeline. That type of expertise of construction and operation, we believe, is directly transferable to this project that we're going to talk about today. And without greater ado, we'll jump right into the project itself. So the Heartland Greenway is a carbon capture and storage, so CCS, I'll try to avoid as many acronyms as possible, but CCS project. It's approximately 1,300 miles of new pipeline infrastructure, 900 of which, or approximately 900 of which, is being proposed here in the state of Iowa. What that network does is connect approximately 20 different receipt points, and those receipt points falling into two major buckets: ethanol and fertilizer facilities. And what this system will do is capture the CO2 at all of those facilities and collectively aggregate it and pull it down to the blue dot you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of this chart, or the map up here, where it will be permanently stored. The project is commercially anchored by Valero, so approximately 8 of those 20 receipt points represent Valero ethanol plants, one of which is present here in O'Brien County, along with about a dozen other processors of, like I mentioned, that ethanol and fertilizer variety. The system also is financially supported through a partnership with BlackRock, and I'll have a little bit more details about kind of the financial and the commercial model here in the slides to come. But before we get too deep into that, I want to take a step back and walk through what is CCS, what is carbon capture and storage. It's new to us here in the corn and soybean belt. I learned about this as part of taking this job as well. But the technology itself is not new. It's been utilized for decades in a number of different applications at different points throughout not just the United States but the world. We do have about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in operation in the country right now. And if you take a step back and think back to middle school or high school science, when we learned about the 3 states of matter, liquid, gas, and solid, or I should say gas, liquid, and solid for this analogy here, but we'll actually touch all of those as part of this project. So at a high level, what this project entails is installing capture equipment at that facility being either an ethanol plant or the fertilizer site, before that CO2 would otherwise be emitted. So capturing that gas, state number 1, dehydrating it, so taking as much water out of it as possible, pressurizing it so that it changes from its gaseous state into a liquid, and then it maintains that liquid status as it moves through that network of pipeline infrastructure. And the reason that we use liquid is really efficiency. So moving as you compress it, it's more efficient to move. And efficiency being critical here, it maximizes the amount of decarbonization potential for the project, right? At the end of the day, that's the goal, is being able to decarbonize these operations. It maintains that liquid status, as I said, through the pipeline infrastructure and ultimately to that wellhead site that was that blue dot. It would actually be a network of wellheads, but the wellhead site in south central Illinois, it moves down an injection well, approximately 1 mile to 1.5 miles underground, where it's injected into a pore space. And over time, that liquid, and I say over time, over thousands of years, so our grandkids, we'll see this liquid ultimately mineralize and become a solid, so your 3rd state of matter. Now, the storage of this particular project largely is taking place in Illinois, but we did want to take a little bit of time to explain a little more about what that looks like. The region in Illinois called the Mount Simon Formation that we're looking at for the storage particular part of this project is actually home to CCS activities right now within the ag processing space. I know it's a little bit further of a drive for those of you on the western side of the state, but if you've gone over when the Farm Progress Show has been in Decatur, you were actually on top of an operating CCS project the entire time. I learned that myself as I was out at the show here later in August. That's as part of ADM's operating project that they've had operating in the Decatur area for the better part of a decade. So much like the pipeline footprint of this project, the pore space side of it, or the sequestration or storage side, also will have relatively little impact on the above ground usage of the ground. So the farmers there will be able to farm over the ground just like they always have. The well sites themselves are permitted by the US EPA, which means obviously a lot of robust monitoring and oversight associated with that Class 6 well permit that we'll need for those sites. And again, this chart is terribly hard to read on the slide, so I apologize, but I did think it was really important that we develop this to scale to showcase just how far below critical water resources, so many of you may have well water, I grew up on well water, the water resources that we depend upon at the top part of that chart. If you look all the way down to the bottom, there's a little blue triangle where ultimately that CO2 is being injected. We're more than a mile below those water resources. I think another critical detail I point out on this particular slide is the depth of cap rock. So approximately 900 feet of cap rock, and that rock effectively serves as a seal to make sure none of that CO2 is seeping up over time. So effectively, the CO2 is staying in place where we put it. And again, this chart falls in that hard to read bucket, and that's one of them that we have blown up on the slide over, or on one of the charts over here on the side. So we've talked a little bit about what and where and kind of how all of this works, but I think it also is really important to talk about why. The facilities that we are partnering with, so those ethanol and fertilizer facilities, have some of the purest quality CO2, and that's really important to projects like this, as well as an abundance of it, just as part of their processes. And that's what makes them great partners for CCS projects. We're focusing on capturing that CO2 that currently is being otherwise just emitted into the air right now. Another common question that we get is, we understand how it works, but how does this financially make sense? And bear with me as I go through analogy. Those of you that have seen me speak before know that I'm a lover of analogies. So if I wanted to get on a bus, I'm going to buy one ticket. If I'm going to take my family on the bus, I'm going to buy 4 tickets. Some similar could be said here. The facilities we are partnering with pay a set fee that is stipulated in their contract of on a per tonnage rate for what they put on the line. What that then allows is those facilities to maintain all of the benefits or the incentives associated with that decarbonization, a couple of which we've got outlined on the slide up here. So some of you may have heard of the 45Q, the federal tax credit associated with permanent storage of CO2. There's incentives associated with lowering the carbon intensity of the ethanol or the end products that are coming to those facilities, like the LCFS, Low Carbon Fuel Standard programs that are predominantly along the West Coast. Additionally, there's opportunities for carbon credits in the voluntary marketplaces, some of which many of you may have seen as farming practice have come evolved into the voluntary markets as well. Those incentives remain at home with those facilities. Now, additionally, another very common question we get is, okay, this all makes sense, but then why is a pipeline necessary? Unfortunately, if you think back to that cross-section, that geological cross-section that was on the prior slide, that geology does not overlap or exist where most of our processors are at. So we don't have that cross-section of geology here in Northwest Iowa or throughout most of Iowa, unfortunately. So in order to connect those processors with the areas that have the ability to provide for that storage, we need a means of connection. And we know that pipelines are the safest means of being able to move the quantity and the nature of the product that we're talking about here. As was mentioned, the project itself has a rather robust footprint here in the state of Iowa, approximately 36 counties. We're going to be having a meeting just like this in each of those, in addition to a virtual meeting as well. So we're starting very early in this process. We've got a long ways to go here yet, but I'm guessing what most of you are most curious about is what this looks like in our backyards here in O'Brien County. The green line, and many of you may have seen this map and received that in that packet that you received in the mail from us. The green line on that route is the center of the proposed corridor. The blue dots on either side of that are approximately a quarter mile on each side. We identified about a half-mile wide corridor throughout the route here. And in determining what that route or that corridor looks like, the overall threshold is looking at how do we minimize the collective impact. And what does that mean? Avoiding population centers, avoiding sensitive ground and sensitive lands, and following existing easements where at all possible. And I know many of you are very curious in more granularity of where you fall along some of these routes here, and we'll have the opportunity to visit with our land agents and teams that are over on the side of the room here following the meeting to look at those details a little more specifically. What does this mean for the state and here at home from an economics perspective? The project itself is estimated to be about a $3 billion investment, with over half of that remaining here at home in the state of Iowa. Not only just the investment from the project predominantly here in the state, but also the employment or jobs associated with that, both from the construction side of the project, as well as the ongoing operations once we commence that. And those of you that have been in the biofuel space like myself for a number of years know that the ethanol of a decade ago is not the ethanol of today. It's continued to improve and get better. And adoption of technologies like CCS are what's going to help that product continue to evolve and get better in the years to come. Constant improvement is really critical in any industry that we look at. And providing and creating demand for, or markets for products that we raise on your farms and on ours is really critical, especially when you're thinking about the predominance of agriculture in the state of Iowa. Plants that implement CCS technology can effectively reduce the CI or the carbon intensity of that end product by 50%, which not only provides longevity for those marketplaces and those local processors for years to come, but for decades to come. And it's not just an economics perspective, there's also significant environmental benefits associated with carbon reduction. All of these data points up here on this slide were calculated using EPA's greenhouse gas calculator on their website. I'll admit, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around what 3 million cars looks like, or 18 million acres. I know what a 40 looks like. I grew up on a farm baling hay too. But what I do think that this helps us rationalize is that this project can have some substantial impacts, help us make progress towards those goals that we've set as an industry, as a state, and as a society as a whole. The impact of the project as a whole is equivalent to roughly 30% of the state of Iowa's commercial, residential, and industrial process emissions in any given year per data from the DNR. I acknowledge, is this everything we need from an environmental perspective? No. But does it help make progress? Absolutely. Another common question is what does this look like from next steps? So projects of this size and scale have a robust timeline associated to them. We are firmly in that third dot on this timeline. The informational meetings is what we're doing here today. We do intend to be filing our petition for the permit with the Utilities Board here in 2022. Along with navigating the additional permits that are going to be associated at the federal level, others at the state level, and all the way down at the local level at the counties and such. Ultimately looking to kick off construction in 2024 so that we can begin to phase in facilities as operations in the latter part of that year into 2025. So that last chart was dots on the timeline. This provides a little bit more detail about what those steps physically look like. And a lot of planning and preparation has gone into the analysis of this project prior to us coming to this meeting here today. We're pretty firmly in that preparation and permitting phase, which is really largely focused around outreach and thus, conversations and meetings like what we're having here today. This chart also provides a little bit more detail about the specificity around the construction process. And another thing I would highlight also is the level of inspection, again, associated with that. We heard a little bit about the role of the county inspectors. There's also third-party inspectors that we'll be bringing in as part of our processes, as well. Ultimately with that goal of full restoration of the ground so that you can continue to utilize it just like you always have. Again, this is another one of those diagrams that falls into the hard-to-read bucket, and we've blown that up on a chart here off on the side as well. So a little bit more about the stage of the process that we're in right now, so right away. Many of you received an informational packet from us in the mail. Some may have already received a phone call from some of our land team agents. Others may be getting those phone calls after this meeting as a follow-up. Part of those conversations are seeking voluntary survey permissions so that we can come on and start looking at the ground. And those conversations are really critical. As we're looking at proposal of this route, I outlined some of those details of what goes into determining the corridor initially. We're gathering any and all publicly available data sets to help aid us in putting forth that proposal. But not all critical information is publicly available. There are unique aspects and attributes of every parcel of ground, both currently as well as future intended uses that aren't in a database somewhere. And the only way that we can truly account for those types of things are through the conversations that we have with you. So really encourage you to participate and be part of those conversations with our land team so that we can help optimize that route so that we have something that works best for everyone involved. Additionally, as we move forward or further into this right-of-way process, we're conducting market surveys to help build out what that initial valuation offer will be. And one thing I'd like to really highlight as part of this is our commitment to being collaborative and negotiating good faith, not only throughout just this stage of the process, throughout the lifeline of the project as a whole. And that means acknowledging that there are no two parcels created equal. No two farms are the same. No two farmers are the same. No two tenants are the same. And so we want to provide and have the opportunity to treat each of those with the unique circumstances that they are due. So what does this look like in a little bit more detail? This project, Heartland Greenway, is being designed for CO2, exclusively, expressly for CO2. Our contracts will reflect that. I will repeat that again, explicitly for CO2. The easements that we are looking for are non-exclusive, which essentially means that it doesn't preclude you from doing other things on the ground. Additionally, we're looking at a 50-foot wide corridor for that permanent easement. You ultimately would be able to farm on top of that post-construction. We additionally would need a temporary easement on top of that, or wider than that, to allow for construction operations as well. From a valuation perspective, as I mentioned before, we're doing some of those market studies on land sales and a lot of the associated factors that go into that valuation to help come up with that initial offering as the beginning point of those negotiations. And I do want to highlight the structure of which we're proposing. We are proposing an option-based agreement, and thus it would be 20% paid upon signing of said agreement, and then the remaining 80% would be paid prior to the commencement of construction from the easement portion of these agreements. Additionally, there are some stipulations in Iowa law for cancellation, and we've outlined those on the slide up here as well. You all know there's a lot of factors that go into the valuation of ground. We've put a couple of those publicly available data sets up here that will help us kind of put forth those initial valuations, but this is meant to be a negotiation. So we want to take all of those factors into account. So as part of that, we encourage you to bring any and all data and information that you have about your land as part of those conversations so that we can develop that fair and equitable valuation. In addition to the easement payment, easement structures, which we outlined on the prior slide, we do acknowledge that there will be crop losses associated with a project like that. We're confident in our restoration processes, and I'll outline those on the next couple of slides. And we expect that you'll regain more than the 20% or 40% yield that was outlined up here. And that's why we're paying approximately 240% of a yield loss compensation, and that would be paid prior to construction. Landowners that acknowledge or see beyond 240% yield throughout the life of the project, we welcome those conversations on a one-on-one basis as we move into that phase of it. And drain tile. As a farm kid, I know just how important drain tile is, and it's not just in this part of the countryside, right? Throughout the whole state of Iowa and really throughout the full footprint of the project. And step one of I haven't heard a noon whistle in a long time. Is it not the noon whistle? Oh, we had this in my hometown. It used to be the noon whistle. So step one of those processes is acknowledging what systems are out there from drain tile, not only what they are, but also where they are, so that we can adequately and efficiently avoid those systems. As part of that, we also intend to have a separation distance from any of the existing tile systems that are out there, so from your system and the infrastructure that we would be putting in. As part of the process, we intend to also bring out, or bring as part of this expertise or experts in land restoration to, on top of or in addition to those county inspectors as part of those land restoration plans that we've talked about, teeing up to ultimate restoration. Additionally, the other thing I want to note is many of you have local tile contractors that you've utilized likely for years that know your ground well. We want you to be able to continue to use those trusted resources and local resources. So in the event that there is damage or things that need to be replaced, we want you to be able to use the contractor that you know and trust, and then we reimburse as the company. There we go. And into that vein of mitigation and restoration, I think the high level here is acknowledgement from our perspective that this is your land. And part of being good stewards of it means acknowledging that and treating it with the utmost respect. What that does entail from an active perspective is minimizing impacts to that as much as possible. Repairing, replacing, and compensating where we do make damages or leave impacts to the ground. I think also that means acknowledging that there's a variety of usage of ground, different attributes of ground. Is it tiled? Is it terraced? Is there waterways? Where are they? That type of aspects. Is it seed corn? Is it pasture? All of those types of things taking into account as we're looking at these particular evaluations. Again, I mentioned bringing in restoration experts as part of that robust ag land restoration plan, which I believe was included as part of your packets as well. And again, ultimately, with that goal of restoring your ground to its most profitable and useful state. I do want to take a moment to walk a little bit through the specifications around the pipe itself. And I'll highlight again, this system is being designed expressly for CO2. Liquefied CO2 is the only thing that this system will move. The design and construction, as well as both the operations and safeties perspective of the line, is overseen by the Office of Pipeline Safety within the US DOT. And we'll have a number of regulatory standards at all different levels that we plan to meet or exceed. As I mentioned before, pressure is a kind of key part of this process. In order for the CO2 to maintain its liquid status, it must be at least 1200 psi. The system itself will have a range of operating pressure, but will be designed so that it exceeds those safety standards associated with that. Placement and size of the pipe is also a common question that we're getting. Minimum of 5 feet depth is what we're looking for, with the general rule of wanting to be below anything else that's out in the countryside. So if there's a natural gas line, a water line, a tile line, we want to be below any of that. Additionally, so size of the pipe will vary throughout the footprint of the project, so anywhere between 6 and 24 inches, just depending on where you are in the scope of the line, how close you are to kind of the trunk of the project, as well as, the closer you get to the ultimate gathering site, necessarily the larger the pipe. As the product itself, so the CO2, liquefied CO2 is leaving the facilities, it does normalize to ground temperature rather quickly. And with the depth of the pipe, we don't anticipate overwarming or cooling of the ground in that particular respect. Additionally, so when you're looking at control, isolation, and really safety purposes, we'll have a number of mainline valves spaced strategically, because based on distances from residences or distances from buildings, distances from communities, all of that will take into account of where we're spacing those valves, which are what can help isolate the product. In the event that there is anything that needs to be shut down, those can shut down in a matter of minutes. And as I mentioned before, pressure is incredibly important to the project and operations of it. So we will need a couple booster stations to ensure that the pressure stays consistent and the product continues to move through the line. And we saved the most important part for last, and that's safety. We'll have 24/7 monitoring of temperature, pressure, and flow throughout the length of the line, along with redundant communication systems that are monitoring a number of different safety aspects. Post-construction, but prior to operations, we have a number of assessments that we have to do to validate the integrity of the system as a whole, in addition to ongoing trainings and communications with local responders, because it's really important that those local responders are also well-versed in what these systems are and how they work. Throughout the operations phase of the project, we'll do regular flyovers to monitor the line, as well as continued outreach and activities like safety drills, and we would bring in the local responders or local communities to be part of that as well. Additionally, enrolling and being part of the 811, Call Before We Dig program that many of us are familiar with to help continue to build public awareness about the placement of the line, along with the routine kind of calibrations and inspections and testings that are associated with the Office of Pipeline Safety. And lastly, the one I leave you with is we acknowledge that there's risks associated with anything and everything, and especially projects of this scale. We do believe that we're proactively mitigating many of those risks through a number of the steps that we do have outlined up here. And with that, I will hand it back over for questions.
Thank you. First, I just wanted to say it sounds like those sirens were just testing the system. There's nothing on the radar that says anything's coming. If that changes, we will follow those procedures I talked at the beginning, but it sounds like it was just testing the system. Okay, before we get to your questions, I do just have one question for the company. If you could go over the procedures to be followed in contacting affected parties for specific negotiations and acquiring voluntary easements. Specifically, I know you said that you will have people call for the surveying. Are those the same people that will be calling for acquiring easements? And if so, are those Navigator employees or is that a third-party land agent team?
So we have retained third-party services for our right-of-way team that will be led by a Navigator employee.
Okay, and they will be the ones calling for acquiring easements?
Correct.
Okay.
And following up on this.
Wonderful, thank you. That was the only clarification I had on my list. So with that, we will now take your questions. As a representative of the IUB, I will take questions on the permit process and the IUB proceedings. Navigator representatives will take questions on the project itself. I have 2 microphones set up that I ask that you come line up and wait. We'll switch between each one. If you need help getting up to a microphone, or if you can't get up to a microphone, you can raise your hand and we will have somebody come get one for you. With that, I will open up the floor for your guys' questions. Thanks.
I have a question for Navigator. We have a small piece of land that is potentially affected, but I also am a tenant. And a lot of the tile in this county was put back in the Depression era on. So you've got clay tile, you've got cement tile, plastic. You talk about compensation in that easement path, but how are we supposed to be compensated if you cut a tile and we don't find it? And we have experience with other pipelines in the Mid-American Wind Turbine Project, where in my own operation, we've had over 130 repairs, and they've missed a bunch of them. And they don't show up on a drought year. But it's not just the damage in that easement, it's the upstream drainage area that affects your yields and therefore your economics. And then the final thing is, on the paperwork I saw, it says you're supposed to notify 14 days before harvest in order to try to negotiate, but you often find these issues on the yield monitor following harvest. And how do we get treated fairly as a tenant? And I'm not trying to comment good or bad on your project, that is a legitimate concern that will affect a large number of people here.
So, one thing for your question, one of the things that is unique amongst every farm is the different tile systems. What type it is, where they're located, what is the outfalls, etc. The initial part of this that we're reaching out for is that feedback on what kind of tile's out there. Do we know where the tile is? Some do, some don't, depending on when it's installed, how it was installed. And so as we get this information, we are also coupling with the farmers and the landowners as well as third-party tile experts. And if there's, certain county drain tile experts has been a representation of a lot of the drain tile out here, we'll work with them on proactive, solutions. One, helping us identifying the pre-construction integrity of the system. What are some, proactive mitigation just prior to construction? Some of it is, sometimes you put headers in ahead of time. Sometimes you put temporary installations in outside of the construction corridor. Some of the previous practices where they would do it just on certain portions, and then they'd drive over it with the heavy equipment that came through. And so, it's one working together and getting the information and, working with, because what's good for one tile system might not be good for the next one. And so getting with the regional people and the subject matter experts, both from the county inspectors, the IUB, the planning, as well as the, documentation of where those temporary installations were located, to ensure that we come back and put a permanent solution in with working with the landowner, or let the landowner specify how they want it done, and then coming full circle back around to doing a post-construction integrity, survey to ensure that tile is operating how it was prior to.
The problem you have, or the challenge you have, is a lot of this tile was put in Depression era or slightly after. We have no way of knowing where those tiles are at, especially on a farm where you purchase it later. And the issue you have is the damage shows up on wet year. I mean, I have tile lines today I'm confident are broken, but we've had 2-3 years of drought. It won't push up again until we get, I've got tiles that haven't run for 2 years. So I haven't seen any language in the packets that were sent out on how you protect the tenant down the road. And I think that's an important issue to look at.
I agree, and thank you for the comment. As far as identifying or encountering not previously known locations of this, so we will have ag inspectors out on the right-of-way, and the county agricultural, the county inspectors will also be cognizant of that. Who can identify a clay tile in a field subsoil? And so we've got a process for identifying those during construction, and again, working with subject matter drain tile experts that'll be doing the repairs. It won't be the pipeline company, right? The subject matter experts for that. And we are accountable for the damages resulting from construction. So should that directly be a result of what happens in the right-of-way, that is something to be worked out with the tenant or the landowner and the company.
But what about yield loss upstream on that right-of-way?
That's what I'm saying, so direct correlation impacts.
Good afternoon. My comments to Navigator. On your slide deck, you had a $1.6 billion impact to the state of Iowa. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on what the benefit's going to be short-term with the construction process, and this being similar to a petroleum pipeline, but that's where it ends, where that impact after this is installed to the communities, to the ethanol plants, to these farmers. So if you could, it's kind of a twofold deal, short-term and long-term. And then as far as the hiring of local help to build this project as well.
Sure, and I'll take the first part of this, and I'll let my colleague Steve take the labor component of it. We are putting the finishing touches. I actually had a conversation with our economist this morning on our very in-depth economic impact study. So we will have a more localized, what does this mean specifically to O'Brien County? from both direct impacts economically, labor, as well as long-term, and for the state as a whole. So we're right on the cusp of being able to finish those data points. So we'll have more details on that, and that will be on our website as well here very, very soon. But I want to make sure Steve mentioned something about the labor components of it as well.
So, thank you. When it comes to the construction and the resources, the Heartland Greenway can't be built without, the highly skilled and qualified trade union resources. We're working with the unions right now to identify the resources to help bring, some of that expertise and dedication to safety and quality to this project.
There are most of those people from out of state.
I'm sorry?
Most of those people will be from out of state.
We've been talking with the local union halls already.
The projects we had in the past are mostly from out of state. My question is, I have two, I have one for Iowa Utility Board, and then I got one for you guys. Would the Iowa Utility Board explain, there's three things. 479B to the public, what that really does mean. 480, what that really means. And Chapter 9. Those are all things. And then the last thing, the indemnity insurance. What happens if they go broke? Even though I know Bedrock is a very wealthy company, what happens if they go broke, and what's the liability issues to them, and how this will affect landowners? And then I have questions for these guys.
Thank you. Okay, so 479B is the statute that is all of the Iowa rules about hazardous liquid pipelines. So statutes are passed by the legislature. They're our highest form of law that we follow. Chapter 9 is our individual rules that our agency have created to kind of specify more details about these processes. Specifically, Chapter 9 is about the restoration of agricultural land. It was recently, updated following some projects that came through the state, feedback we got from landowners about things that were working and things that weren't when it came to restoration and the restoration of specifically agricultural lands. So those outline the procedures companies and the Iowa Utilities Board follows and looks to when restorational land. Chapter 480 is underground storage facilities. That doesn't really apply here, but it's the same idea as 479B, which is it's a statute, the highest form of the law in Iowa that we follow as well.
Okay, I'm back to you again on Chapter 9.
Yeah.
You're talking about practices. How is your rules, because they're going to go by your rules. They won't have to follow your rules. What is your stripping practices? Topsoil strip, how you go about stripping, preparing that land? Because you wrote the rule, you have to write the rules that they follow. How's that occur?
Yeah, I will let her answer. We have the rules. I don't.
Because that's a big one. That's what
Yes, no, we have the rules, and it should explain a little more just in that how they have to follow and
Okay, let's see what
regard
they have
that.
to say.
Sure, so, and that Chapter 9 was very recently updated. I think the last update was even this month. So they are constantly, they have implemented a very robust lessons learned in that. The current practice, as outlined in there, is full width topsoil segregation. And the depth of that topsoil is also prescribed in there, how that is identified, with a series of cross sections of soil probes to determine the soil depth that will be formed by qualified soil scientists. At intervals, 500-foot intervals, maximum 500-foot intervals on that. And so again, that's stripped all the way across the width of the right-of-way.
How deep are you going?
As deep as the topsoil is.
Okay, what's topsoil and what's subsoil?
The 8 horizons into the 3
What is it?
horizons.
Do you know
the
what
B1,
topsoil and subsoil is? Because there's two different segments.
Absolutely.
In the air material. So you have 3 segments. So what are you taking off? The topsoil and your organic matter are the first thing you should separate. How many
Absolutely.
inches is that?
That will be determined when we're doing these
Should be
surveys.
12 inches, 12 to 18 inches. I'll just give you the answer. What's the subsoil? That should be segregated, pushed farthest away. That's the first thing you remove. Is so if it's not done, I'd like the Iowa Utility Board to understand this. I just went through this in our farm doing other things. So you better do it correctly because we don't mess up the soil. Second thing, The subsoil
Yeah.
is then, goes down to basically about 36 inches, or in these good, less soil areas, it can be deeper.
Yeah.
So you have 36, so everything there is pushed aside to the other side. So they
They
should
are
be the
separate.
farthest away. You can't do your 75 feet, I'll tell you that right now.
It's
There's
meant
no
to-
way, there's no way they can do 75 feet. It's more like 150 feet when you have to come in and push.
It is 125 feet. So
Okay, so
it's the
your
50
easement
plus
should,
the
it should
75.
stay at 125 feet, then get on the secondary.
I'm
If you have a
sorry,
permanent, instead of 75, it should be 125 feet at least.
It's
So
total
it-
125.
What's that?
It's a total of 125.
So the-
Oh,
Plus
right,
75.
right, so, again, I'll agree with that. All right, and then the third thing, where do you put your permanent soil? Where's that going? So they gotta be separated. The first two have to be out farthest away. Where's your permanent apparent material go at? Where are you gonna put that at?
So it's all segregated on the right of
Do you know
way
what
and
permanent
separate
soil
piles.
is? That's where you're gonna put your pipe. Where's where you're putting your pipeline? That should be right next to the land. What has happened in the past, these construction companies, you have your land agent, they're working for them, construction companies working for them. So now we have to get our rights correct and get in order. The permanent soil has to be right next to the hole where you're digging. That is the closest spot to it. Most Dakota land companies, I saw some there, they intermix things. I'm not saying they did all of it, but if you intermix things, what happens if you put permanent soil on top of the ground?
Yeah, you can't run next to it.
Okay, guess what? Now you say you got a 3-year plan. We did we love Alliant. Alliant was a great company to work with. They did exactly what we wanted. Some places people weren't, farmers weren't do their due diligence, and some things happen on construction. But what happened, we noticed, if you don't put that permanent in first, that has to go over your pipeline. Second, you then take your topsoil, push that back, and then, or your subsoil. Then you put your topsoil. Do you know what happens? You disrupt your fertility levels. And you talk about 3 years, it's an 8-year plan. We just got done off the 4th year of our farm, where they went through, we took a 30% yield hit, where they did things correctly. A 30% yield hit. So now, that compaction is not going to go away right away. It's an 8-year process, not a 3-year. So you should be changing your plan to 8 years. Also, you should have an 8-year fertility plan, because your fertility is going to get disrupted. Your phosphorus, potassium is always in the top 4 to 6 inches, so that needs to be taken care of. So I got off, I wanted to get you guys to answer that question. The eminent domain, the indemnity insurance, what happens if they go broke? I've got $5 million liability insurance on our property on 290 acres. So what's going to happen? That's my valuation on the property. What's going to happen? Am I going to be compensated if they take up 20 acres of my land? What's the indemnity fee on that?
So they will have to do a surety bond with us to make sure that they have enough assets in the state besides just their pipeline, and then
What's that mean?
they will have,
How much would that be an acre? So we got to get down to the acre. That's where all these people are interested. What is the cost going to be, or the indemnity that they would receive per acre? Because that's a big factor. Because you got land here, I think these guys, $17,000 to $20,000 an acre land. You'll drastically, if you don't do things properly, soil till compaction is going to occur. You won't do things properly. So, I look at pros and cons. And CO2 is good for growing corn crop.
yeah, so the utilities board will have them do a surety bond. I can have the company go over more of their insurance and their liability.
There is a minimum in state code that traditionally has been much larger, just based on size and scale of the project.
I'd say a lot of the laws that have been written weren't written to our advantage. I'll just put it to that. So that's why I'm talking about this land. It should be 3 segments with a permanent, parent material right next to the hole. If that's not done, I'll be on here. You guys, you know what? The last thing I want to ask is, I had all our farms, all our abstracts for on today. Who takes precedent? Because I probably got 5 different easements right away, and I've already signed my easement with, and I guess this might be to you guys. My easements I've signed with, to Alliant. If I have to do any construction or anything, if I do any tiling, I have to contact them. If I want to go over their lines, I have to contact them. The only thing is I have everything patent title, so they went over mine. and so they had to pay me for all the fixing that then my attorney, Tyler did. And you want to wait at least a year before you tile, because you don't want to do it the first year. It messes everything up. So what is your, who takes priority first? Because my attitude's mine. These guys here, it might be Mid-America, who take precedent over everybody. Because I've got at least 5 or 6 different easements and right-of-ways already on my farm.
Yeah, you can have more than one easement on your land, and then I can let them, they kind of discuss, they're not exclusive.
But who takes priority?
Priority in what?
Who of all those that are listed? I've got rural water, I've got manure management, the farm of the Devil Hudson, we've got Alliant, and I also got Mid-America. So who takes precedence on those issues? If you're in conflict, I've already talked to Alliant about your issue coming, if you came on my property. Who takes precedent? Who's the company that will take precedent in that situation?
Precedent, so in the sense of if there was damage done or
There's
a
conflict.
challenge or a...
Both.
Okay.
All the things, because when we go to litigation, now you talk about liability and who's going to be liable, who pays that cost. And the problem is I have to go hire an attorney. You guys are, we have to go hire attorneys, find out. That's why I knew about 479B, and I also knew about Chapter 9. Those are the 2 main focuses, and that's what I'm going to address. So.
Yep. Steve, do you want to speak a little bit to how that not necessarily co-location, but how we work with and proactively identifying other utilities?
How we work with all utilities, one, as we're reaching out with the landowners, we also reach out to the adjacent utilities, water, power, other pipelines, etc. As we go through that, when we have these easements, ours is non-exclusive, so, and we're trying to co-locate for public awareness and everything else. As we get into some of these utility crossings, alignments, we have encroachment agreements, and basically, just like with all stakeholders, we look at to ensure what this installation doesn't adversely affect the existing utilities. When it comes to, the precedence, it's kind of a specific,
Who's responsible? Because at some point in time, there could be something happen, and somebody's got to be liable.
Yeah, and so what happens is, if there is a release, or if there's something that happens, all 3 get notified.
And what happens if there's a release? If you have a swoon that occurs?
Let's take one at a time, if you don't mind.
Well, you just made the comment, that's why I thought I'd come back right away.
I'm sure that's going to be a question.
We'll make sure you don't get to leave the mic until we get your answers.
So, because sometimes with, you have, if there's, let's say there's 3 utilities, different, 2 pipelines or water line. Some, there's some third-party damage or some evidence of unplanned release. All 3 would come out to investigate.
Right.
And then, as you come through, that damage and liability is 100% on the utilities. It's not on the landowner.
How long will it take to actually reconcile that?
And so one, as we're federally regulated, we can't maintain operations with no leaks.
Right.
And so one is, when in the event of any damage or something, the first thing is to isolate and ensure a safe area. Then, as some, utilities are regulated on different timescales, with us being under 195 in the federal government, we can't let that sit. We can't go back into operations until that issue is.
But it takes me to go through the courts and all the money if I have to fight the situation.
Usually it's.
Well, I'll
I
just
don't
tell you,
want to
it doesn't
speculate,
work always the way you present it all the time, but it might be in your case. And the thing is, like on Alliant, in our situation, you're going east to west. My tiles are north and south, where you'll be going through, and I'm pattern tile, so a mile long, it's a big problem. But the neighbor right next to me, he has 7 or 8 transmission lines, because we've got Midco, Mid-America, I'm right in Clay County. We've got Mid-America, and we got Alliant that's got a high electric transformer line. So all 8 transmission lines from all the 7 to 8 transmission lines that are coming from our area for Alliant are going to their Alliant main substation. There's 7 to 8 in that 1 mile. That takes his whole farm. And if you're going to go east to west, you're going to go through 7 to 8 of his. And they're all basically 60 inches depth.
So, that's a very unique.
That would be a very, very bad area for you to.
Well,
put a
and that's
system.
why there's a lot of things that, as we've looked at, that's why we have a half-mile rule. We don't know exactly, and that's as we get more due diligence where, yes, if there is a corridor that we're crossing, there's certain installation technologies where we might do that trenchless, where we're 30 feet below using, a horizontal directional drill, but we'll work with that utility as well as that landowner to come up with a mutually beneficial solution.
I have other questions, I'll go to another meeting sometime, and I'll ask you those questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. I can restate it if that would be easier. Okay, I'll, Yep, so the question was a minimum of 5 feet deep and a diameter of the pipe that could be up to 24 inches, and is that to the top of the pipe or the bottom of the pipe? And Steve, I'll let you have that one.
So one, as we look at there was a big range of diameter pipes. Here in O'Brien County, we're looking at, with the 4 different legs, 8-inch, 12-inch, and 16-inch diameter pipelines. When we talk about the minimum depth of the cover, that is from natural grade to the top of the pipe. And so, it's not cut grade of this, it's a total, a minimum of 60 inches. When you count some of the drain tiling systems and other utilities, it could be well deeper than the 5 feet. Yes, the minimum.
To the top of the pipe, yes.
From natural grade or tillable soil, all the way down the top of the pipe would be a minimum of 5 feet. And within that 5 feet, as there is a lot of agricultural, about 3 feet down, we'll have what they call warning tape. As one of the big issues is, third-party damage associated with new pipelines. We're installing some proactive measures about 3 feet down in some of the spoil. Once we put that initial permanent spoil back in, as a proactive measure, if somebody's digging or tilling and you see this tape letting you know there's something down there, stop before, there could be a potential third-party damage to the pipeline.
Us a little bit more about any other projects you guys have done and where they were? Just so I couldn't find any more information on it.
Sure. So Navigator CO2 is a new iteration of the Navigator company that has done traditional pipeline infrastructure. Steve, it's a couple of projects. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the history of that?
So, this Navigator CO2 is the third entity that has been created with, the management team that has kind of came in waves. Historically, we've done the energy sector infrastructure when it comes to, hundreds and thousands of miles of midstream infrastructure in, some of the, various states in the energy and oil and gas sector. So you have Navigator Energy Services.
Oh, ma'am, I'm actually sorry. We're going to have him go first. Thank you.
Yes, my question is for the IUB, and I'm wondering why we're holding this meeting today. Has IUB already determined that this is in the public use?
No, sir. These are the informational meetings are required to be the first step before a petition is even filed. So the IUB has nothing in front of it about this project right now. We're learning along with you guys at these informational meetings. This is our 4th or 5th one we've been at so far. So there's not even a petition in front of the IUB yet. As to public use, that will only be brought up if eminent domain is requested. And currently, again, nothing has been requested. There's no petition in front of us. So we're not even at any kind of decision point. We don't have anything in front of us. So we're just at the information gathering stage and informing landowners of their rights.
So in other words, can they build if you don't determine if it's in the public use?
they will have to submit a petition to us first. If they don't ask for eminent domain, there will be no question of public use. If they request public use, or excuse me, if they request eminent domain, that is when public use would be determined or looked at.
So what input can we give you to stop this thing?
You can put comments
So
in.
what kind of information?
Anything that you think is important or useful, why maybe you do or don't think this would be a public use, why you do or do not support the project, questions you have, anything really at all that you have thoughts about on this project should be put in the docket. We recommend that you do that there.
It seems to me, if they get public use, we're all screwed up here. But if there's any way to stop it, I don't see what you're saying is going to help. If you're the only ones that get to rule if it's public use, we need to convince you that it's not in the public use.
I'll add some additional information that might be helpful for everyone to understand just about how the process works. So there are two separate issues that will be addressed when the company files their permit, their application for a permit. First off, to get the permit to build the pipeline, if they didn't need eminent domain, they would still have to get permission to build the pipeline. And the standard for that is that it meets a public convenience and necessity. And then if they want eminent domain, then they have to get to the question of public use. And what happens after they file their application for the pipeline permit is that there will be multiple parties involved who will look at all of the facts. A consumer advocate will be one of them. There will probably be other parties who intervene. It is not uncommon for landowners to get together and intervene, to hire an attorney and intervene. Environmental groups often intervene. So there will be numerous parties who will be asking for additional information and asking questions and will challenge the information that the pipeline files at the hearing and then present arguments to the utilities board about whether or not they think the permit should be granted.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Mary.
Hi, I have a follow-on question to that lady's question. So and from the premise of when you're seeking a permanent easement from landowners, you're asking these people to go into business with you permanently, right? And so I think a good question that I have is when you look at the entity that is building this pipeline, there is a project announcement that says Valero and BlackRock partner with Navigator to effectively do this project. I'd like to understand who this entity is up to Valero and BlackRock, and I'd like to know the ownership, because I think if you're asking individuals to go into business permanently with you, there should be clear understanding of the parties that you're in business with. So can you answer that?
Yes. So to take it high level, I'm trying to think multifaceted to your question.
Yeah, it's a big problem because there's a lot in there, isn't there?
Well, I just want to make sure I adequately answer it here for you. So yes, Valero is our commercial anchor. That has been publicly announced. They are a number of those receipt points. They do not have an ownership interest in Navigator.
In any Navigator entity?
In Navigator CO2, which is proposing this particular project, which is relevant today, no, they do not have the ownership interest in Navigator CO2. They are a partner as part of this project. BlackRock, in the sense of we are funded we're funded through an infrastructure fund within BlackRock. So they have a number of infrastructure funds within the BlackRock entity. Those funds come from pension funds, school endowments, a number of different funds of what go into, as you alluded to, BlackRock's a very large entity. We're one small piece of that pie in terms of an equity provider as part of the project.
So who owns Navigator CO2? Is that 100% held by a BlackRock entity, or who owns it?
Privately held.
So Navigator CO2 is privately held, and you're not going to disclose who that is?
It's privately held by Navigator.
And who owns Navigator?
Entity.
Okay. Well, I
It's a
have the
combination
document,
of
'cause
management.
it's very hard to understand this. I have another document here that says BlackRock, the Global Energy and Power Infrastructure Fund III, is invested in this project, and that is an announcement here. So I'm just trying to understand this.
Which is the infrastructure fund that I mentioned before, right? One of those particular infrastructure funds. It's one of the many entities, as I understand it.
Exactly, it's so hard to understand this.
Well, BlackRock is very large, as I understand it. That's not my level. That's
I'm just really struggling to understand how to get from there to who we're being asked to go into business with. So this description of BlackRock, at least, says there's 50 institutional investors, including public and private pension funds, as you said, sovereign wealth funds, which my understanding of sovereign wealth funds are investment funds of foreign governments, is, I don't know, you can clarify that. Foundations, insurance companies, and nonprofit organizations across the US, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So can you clarify the types of entities that are investing in this project somehow with the pipeline, particularly the foreign governments or potential individuals that are involved in this project by being investors in the BlackRock Fund, which publicly states they're doing this project?
Yes, and I believe that, so the description that you just provided there of the wide breadth of what goes into BlackRock broader umbrella is correct. And I'm not here to speak on behalf of that particular entity or the intricate details associated with that particular structure. But, you know, we fall within one particular investment branch in that infrastructure fund, as you mentioned from the press release, which is one particular segment within BlackRock. And I apologize, I don't have a level of detail and knowledge base to give you more specificity beyond that.
Okay. I think it's very difficult to understand who is behind the project and who you're asking people to go into business with. So I think it would be helpful for people to make decisions if there's more clarity as to who owns Navigator, what that business arrangement is, how that relates to potential foreign governments as well. I do have a follow-up question as well, if you permit me the time. So it's my understanding that the recently passed federal infrastructure bill has a whole bunch of funding for CO2 pipelines. Can you extrapolate what type of funding you are expecting to receive in any Navigator venture? I don't want to get into legal entities and who's what, but big picture, what is the federal infrastructure dollars you're expecting to utilize?
Sure, and the simple question of that would be likely none. The federal support that's being proposed, which, as you alluded to, it's nothing's a done deal in Washington, D.C. until it's, you know, they catch dry. But you are right that there has been proposals both as part of the infrastructure bill as well as the reconciliation bill. I believe it's commonly known as Build Back Better, that has provisions in support of continued build out of CCS, or carbon capture and storage, like this project, infrastructure. As I mentioned before, our model is such that those incentives, specifically that 45Q tax credit incentive on a per tonnage rate, remains with the local facilities that we are working with. So in the case of O'Brien County, that dollar credit is staying with your facility in Hartley. That's not coming to us as Navigator CO2. And to that vein, so in the event that the particular proposal that is on the table right now were to pass, when that $50 goes to $85, our balance sheet doesn't change. It does here in your local community.
It's just simply privately funded.
So are you saying that you're not going to, you know, if these bills pass, you're not going to take the federal funding that's in any of these bills right now?
Our economic is a tariff-based system. People pay us a fee to move their product for them.
See, and this is what's really confusing, because there's probably some entities involved that are getting this federal funding and some of these subsidies. You know, I think there's a lot of loans, other things, expenses that could be paid as part of this. It'd be helpful to have a summary of who is getting the federal funding that is being put behind this.
You are correct that there are loan guarantee programs and other programs that are part of those bills. Our structure is not, we don't intend at this point to take advantage of those. Our commercial model is such that we don't have those.
There's no previous federal funding on any of the other Navigator entities and build outs, nor are there any current plans to utilize any federal subsidies as we build out Navigator.
Well, this Navigator entity, the people that you represent.
Yes, that's what I'm saying right now.
So then maybe my question is for who is not represented here, that is also part of the project, so, thank you.
Before the next question, sir, I'll let you go, but if you are having conversations, we ask that you maybe take those out into the hall, just so it's easier for everybody else to hear the questions being asked and the answers given, so thank you.
May we ask that those who are answering stand up so that we can see you while you are talking?
Yes, we will start standing upon answering questions. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so I was a little disappointed that Navigator didn't have their PowerPoint presentation printed out so that we could take it with us or give it to other parties that weren't able to make it here today. I know you did allude to it being online somewhere, so if IUB could give us the link to that so we could access it and, you know, tell other people who haven't made it here, look at this and they could see their presentation, that would be wonderful.
Yes, it is on our electronic filing system that I've been mentioning under that docket number HLP 2021-003.
So you could just jot down an HTTP address, you know, real quick here, and then tell us so we can write it down rather than have to navigate all these web pages to find it. That would be really great.
I will
It's,
take
it should, it's also on our website, and which has got the website on our information cards, and it's directly.
So you got it on a card, a business card?
Yes, the email address, the website address.
So just to clarify, I don't think it's on the website yet. We did file it as part of the IUB provisions. You do
Right.
have to file it 2 weeks in advance. There's no sense in making things difficult on you. We'll throw it up on the website alongside of where we've got all of our list of
Okay.
meetings, because easy access to information is important. So
Okay,
absolutely,
perfect. Yeah,
we'll do
it's-
that after this
I
meeting
mean,
today.
that's all nebulous if you don't have it.
It is,
Right.
it is, and I think trying to conserve some papers.
So in a secondary
The
question,
website, I'm just gonna ask them to put it back up, the IUB's contact information on that slide deck, their last slide does have their website on it, if we wanna put that up.
And
Is it way back, okay.
yeah, and we also, that contact information, it should be on in your packet. Our customer service can also help you find that slide deck on our electronic filing system.
But sir, we'll
Okay.
get it on the website.
Yeah. all right, the second question was, how close can you be to a waterway, like the Ocheeden and stuff? So your pipeline is proposed to go across the Ocheeden, and I'm sure other waterways. How do you propose to do that? Are you going under a certain?
I'll have Monica take that one about how we
Okay,
traverse
thank you.
waterways and specific details about all of those in broad spectrum from waterways of all size and scale.
Certainly, so again, the pipeline will be below ground, and it is below the depth of those water bodies. Depending on the size of the water body and the location, and there's various crossing methods we use, depending on the circumstance to install those. Some are open cut, where we have it, in about 24 hours, we cut through there and restore it. Others are a trenchless technology using a drill or a boring machine to go under it.
Couple questions. This is from a governmental standpoint in Bryan County. What forms, this is probably to the IUB, what forms of local control does O'Brien County have?
So your county supervisors are the
Yes.
ones that, they have been notified of this project by the IUB. They are the ones that hire the county inspector. Additionally, they work with that county inspector, and sorry, I forgot about the standing. They hire the county inspector and work with them. If the land restoration plan isn't being followed, the inspector talks with the county board of supervisors, and the county board, if it continues to not be followed, the county board of supervisors petitions us for us to look into that and make sure everything's following. So your county board of supervisors is involved in this plan as it goes along as well.
Okay, and what is the process then for us to establish on the county's right-of-ways?
So that would be a county board of supervisor question. I don't know if we have.
I am.
Oh, okay, great. So you guys would work with, we don't do local, sorry, can you repeat your question just so?
In other words, on our right-of-ways, roads, and in particular, the right-of-ways of the roads, what local control does the county have, the supervisors have?
So we'll be seeking road crossing permits and right of entries for turnoffs onto our right of way from the counties.
Okay, and typically, say on a gravel road, what is the process of going through that gravel road?
Across it,
Boring?
yeah, all part of that permit process.
All boring, no, on gravel roads? Boring underneath, I assume?
Usually, as we seek out these permits, we look at it, is it, all asphalt roads or board or the gravel roads? Some are, some aren't, but that's where we work with, really direction from the county on how, if it's a county maintained road or if it's a private gravel road, what is the installation method to ensure there's no interruption?
Okay. Second question, does the Board of Supervisors have any say of what happens on, other than the inspector, maintaining to the landowner's agreement and so on? Does the county supervisors have any oversight over that, or can we set stipulations on private ground? I don't know the answer.
It's not our experience that the county has control over private property in these
Understood.
instances for the project.
I'm just making sure that, stressing the landowners, it is your agreement with the entities here that has to be done. And then the last question I have, this is more towards Navigator. EMA services, as far as training and so on, and gas leak protection and so on. Will there be any monies put forth by Navigator, the entities of Pipeline, towards local rescue agencies and so on, as far as training, equipment that may be needed in case of an issue with the pipeline?
Absolutely. Part of that process as we go through, not only with the planning, some of the construction activities, so the first emergency responders kind of know where everything's at, what to look for. As we go through that process, we work with one on what stuff do you need to help support this, and it's a mutual discussion as we go through on as we collaborate on here's the risks we see, what is a leak look like, what are the mitigation activities, how do you isolate it, how do you educate people in a certain area, what personal protection devices would you might need to go and investigate. That's all a process, and basically make sure that the emergency responders are trained, equipped, as well as do drills to see how those plans are working. And as we do simulations, as we go on with the lifetime data set.
Okay. In the initial plan, will there be dollars figured towards that will state in O'Brien County, the fire departments, the rescue squads, and so on, will be receiving SCBAs and so on and so forth in case of a cloud, shall we say?
It's, I would say there's a set budget. It's more of, where I don't want to put a certain money, but that's all you're going to get. It's what do we need to do this? And so as we go through it, that's what we work on. It's, from our perspective, this is what we think from the county supervisor. Y'all know your county and your capabilities better than anybody. And so it's that working back and forth, and it's just a communication between the two teams.
Okay. And therefore, our EMA director will be in contact and might go over a plan for that.
Yeah, and like I said, our right-of-way agents, they'll also be coming out, talking to, for permits. That's, getting those names and that dialogue going earlier, the better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This is to Navigator, and I was educated a long time ago. I'm old, and I would like to address what I think is the elephant in the room, and that's the CO2. When I went to high school and grade school, is a good thing, that it makes plants grow. I've got some little charts here, it talks about CO2 increases, enhancing corn production a lot. CO2 helps to feed more people worldwide. First and foremost, CO2 is a plant food, and it means moisture soil. And I've been talking with a lot of Iowans about this, and there's great concern that there is something happening across our prime farm ground that does not need to happen, that we need CO2, and that this is the current environmental jargon training that has happened across the nation, and that it's definitely just simply a great transfer of wealth, and that middle-class Americans and farmers will be heard. And I don't know if you're getting any questions or comments like that in these things, but I wanted to take the opportunity. Thank you. And there are hundreds of scientists that have said there's no such thing as global warming, climate change, except of course we know it changes. And we're all shocked that it's 40 degrees at the end of November up in northwest Iowa. But there is some scientists, they wrote President Trump a letter, that's why he pulled us out of the Paris Accords. But they have one comment that I just want to share, and I'm going to just shut up and sit down. It says, such action, meaning this global warming, is foundational to reversing unfounded policies that even their most devoted acolytes admit do not improve environmental conditions, but do impose hardships broadly, particularly on those most vulnerable citizens trying to get on the ladders of success within their own societies. And my concern is that people are going to just go along with, we need to get the CO2 out of the air, when indeed CO2 is a blessing. We've been living with it for about 6,000 years, and there's a lot of good stuff that why this shouldn't be built. Thank you.
I do want to take, I don't know if there's a specific question there, but I do want to make sure there's a couple of your points that you made though too. And agree, right? We need CO2 as part of many of life's processes. Unfortunately, we have been pulling a lot of carbon out of the ground for hundreds of years as part of industrial processes as well. And this is inversely taking some of that carbon that we have introduced into the atmosphere and putting it back. Everything in a delicate balance. We utilize a lot of CO2. It is important for livelihood. It's important for our crops, but there is a balance to things. And so, additionally, I think the other factor I would note is there's market drivers. There's a demand in the marketplace for reducing the carbon intensity of not just our fuels, our inputs, but all products of all walks of life. So as a society, there is a drive to look at and evaluate the carbon intensity, and that's really what's pushing some of these projects forward. And we're providing a conduit for those customers that are wanting to do that, like the plants here in your community that are looking for ways to be able to do that. And so that's effectively what this project is providing.
I'm also one of the county guys. I just saw this map and to the IUB, I was just kind of wondering where the deviation is. But this is Summit Carbon Solutions map, and it's a nice horizontal line going across Bryan County for 24 miles. On the half-mile line, where you don't disrupt anybody's pattern tiling, probably, a lot less chance. Where this one seems like it's a lot more disruption. And also, it gets pretty close to Hartley, within 1 mile at 2,100 PSI, and a big pipe. I think I was quoted in the paper that it's like, you know, something extravagant going off that you'd have a rupture or leak. And I just, you know, this crisscrossing of this Bryan County is the second highest priced land values in the state of Iowa. And this just looks like a big target, a bullseye to me. You know, why us? We don't have zoning in Bryan County, but yet, you know, we value everything that we have, and a lot of farmers here have spent time, money, effort to tile their ground, and our tile, our waterways, that's our infrastructure. Plus, we have 900 miles of Mid-America transmission lines. We're the largest wind-producing county in the state. We have been. And there's 700 and some miles with just one rural water company of that kind of ground that goes along our roadways and feeds and fuels our farms. And to cut through all this stuff, for this project, I think, we like Valero. They're a great taxpayer and everything. I have another question is this deemed renewable energy? Will this be taxed at full rate or at a 30% renewable energy? when it's finished? And also, is there any deviation to this? I drove some of this route this morning, and some of it I see is on transmission line, right away. Will these farmers get paid for tearing up easement again? Because they've dealt with it once before, and now we're traveling this one that goes a mile and a half north of Highway 18 that follows the transmission line. And, then they probably thought that was overhead, but now we're going underground. So, who owns the right of way to that, and then there's payment for all these landowners on that again?
Sure, so let me take your tax question first, and then I'm gonna hand over maybe the specificities of the route. Obviously, we've got to get to Hartley to get to the plan. There's only one way to do that, right? The tax and payment type question, and then we'll go over to the routing piece of it. So we will pay however the state determines to value CO2. There isn't specifics outlined yet. We're evaluating it based on our economic models as if it's valued similar to pipeline infrastructure that exists in the state today. But the Department of Revenue will have to determine how they do that valuation that will be paid into the state from the company and then distributed out based on the footprint of the project. That's traditionally how that's worked from a taxing and then remitting of those back to the county's perspective. I'm going to hand it over to my team here from the routing question about how and why we got to where we got there.
Sure. With respect to the co-location with existing infrastructure, that is a routing objective oftentimes. That's why you see the co-location with the utility line. Our easement where we are co-located would be abutting that existing easement, and possibly use for workspace, things like that happen, and we'll be coordinating with that utility company in that regard. But absolutely, separate and distinct payment for our project and our impacts will occur.
And O'Brien, we can't take one county in a vacuum too. As I said, we've got 20 receipt points, so we have to think about how we're coming into the county because we're generally coming from somewhere else to get there, especially O'Brien County is the sweet
We just
spot.
have one ethanol plant, and it
Yep.
seems like, we're kind of getting beat up here with this map.
You're in a sweet spot in comparison to a lot of other ones.
Okay, what about that?
We'll be here as long as you need us.
Hi, my mother is actually the landowner here, and so I'm just a little bit late to the party and trying to get my head wrapped around everything that's going on. But as one who's potentially going to inherit this land, what happens if this pipeline goes through and it ultimately leaks? What is the recourse that I could have being the landowner? It's a cash rent land right now, so also what does that do to that potential income?
So I'll have Steve talk through what physically a leak looks like, and then the liability, I think, was kind of the second part of your question as a landowner, what anything would be associated with that.
So one, I try to go in, the sequence of events. First, our job is to keep the product in the pipeline at all times. We have several redundant control systems or operational methods to ensure that doesn't happen. In the unlikely event of a rupture or a leak, what a traditional leak would look like would be something as a discharge of a CO2 fire extinguisher that we see all over the place. But basically, CO2 is usually, is deemed in higher concentrations as an asphyxiant. It displaces oxygen, and it's heavier than air. And so in the event of some of the telltale signs of what, a release would look like in a low-lying area with no wind would be just like what comes out of a CO2 fire extinguisher, a little gray cloud. And then it would eventually dissipate in the air because it's in the air right now.
So there is no impact to the actual ground itself?
From an environmental impact, it's slim to none. And that's where it's, when it comes to the waters and everything else, there's no contaminants when it comes to the environment because it's good for your crops. It's good for,
Right.
Now, and when it comes to, the risk why it's deemed hazardous, it's, due to its being a high concentrations. And in that localized area of a potential leak or a leak, if it's calm, it's going to sit there until it naturally dissipates.
And the liability.
Oh, and then the liability, again, that's 100% on Navigator, one, to keep it there, as well as, address any damage or liability associated with that leak and release of the product.
So we as the landowner would just have to work with you then, if there were any repercussions? Yes. I mean, it's deemed a hazardous pipeline for a reason. I mean, I understand that it's in the air, but it's compressed into this liquid format, so it's highly concentrated. So when there's a leak, and there's potential that it will, of course we say we don't think it will happen, but things do happen. Again, I have to run after it, or my mother does, and so that means we have to work with you. And do we have to then take legal action to get any kind of recourse, or?
No. So one, it's, what happens, it's really on, us to isolate, make sure it's a safe environment, working with emergency responders in that event, and making sure everybody's safe. When it comes to compensations or the damage that we got to get in or fix anything, that's 100% on us without any, typically no legal, interaction unless, if there's a dispute on how far that damage or what that claim was. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This actually wasn't one of my questions, but with what the other party raised. So you're addressing liability, land, environment. What about human life? What studies have been done regarding a potential break of a pipeline? How are people impacted within a certain radius or distance of the break or the explosion?
That's a great question. And so right now, as we put the corridor up there, we've worked on, the theoreticals. It's a half-mile corridor. We don't know exactly where everything's going to go. We don't know exactly where some of these mainline valves are. And so what we're doing right now are what they call plume studies on certain intervals of valve spacing and the pressures and the diameters of the volume in there to get these plume sizes, associated with a theoretical leak. And as we look at that, we slide it through the route corridor and see what is that potential impact radius and who could be impacted with that. And as we see if we get closer to a populous area, we put more valves in there to shrink that potential impact radius or move that alignment to get away from some of the risks associated to human life.
So there is no question that it is dangerous to human life, right?
At high concentrations, it is dangerous.
And also, I heard you say staying away from populated areas, and granted, we're not Des Moines, but we consider Hartley to be a populated area, right? And I realize Valero is at Hartley, but that's where this thing intersects. At Hartley, within a mile, a half a mile of a populated area, I would tend to think there would be a pipe from Valero away instead of having this thing crisscross right at Hartley, where potentially 1,500 lives are impacted by a break.
Well, and that's what we're doing right now. That's why we're getting out here, trying to do the due diligence. Are there better routes where what we've done is we've combined some that we think minimize the collective impact. Now it's getting the feedback from, is there a better route on this? Is there a better way around Hartley? And when I say minimize the collective impact, sometimes you have to go to wherever the plane is. Sometimes that is a more populous area. And so we modify the design and safety factors to help mitigate that, where it's maybe a higher design factor, thicker pipe, more valves, etc., or monitoring devices associated when we do have to come closer to a populous area to pick up some of the planes or some of the customers.
Okay. Thank you. What is the estimate for the number of booster valves and check valves in the county, and will they be physically located above the ground? What impact will those have?
So with the current design that we have, there is no booster station in O'Brien County. You know, as we're looking at the valve spacings, you know, we're probably at anywhere from a 20 to 30 mile interval for those valves. If you look at an average, as we get closer, they'll be more frequent. As we've done due diligence and lessons learned from other existing transportation systems, trying to minimize range connections. You know, and so basically burying these valves, not having them above grade. When you have these automatic valves, these check valves that have no interaction to isolate in the event of you know, a system reversal and some of the, you know, risk to it. There's some that are basically, you know, electric actuated to seal it off, but most of those, if not all of those, should be buried valves.
So another question, what construction is permitted over the easement area? So I as a landowner grant you an easement, what am I permitted to construct or develop over the 50 feet or 75-foot permanent easement area?
So the restrictions for lane use over the easement is permanent infrastructure. So building a building foundation of that nature.
So you could not build a building, is that correct?
Correct.
How about trees?
Trees of a certain size and diameter are maintained over a more narrow corridor, not necessarily the full 50, but trees over the center of the pipeline, and you know, certain root expansions are taken out.
So no buildings, limited trees.
Yes.
Very limited development, in other words.
Right, those two are the other conclusions.
And do we need permission? Let's say, for example, tile has to be installed. So do we need permission to install tile through the easement area?
You don't need permission. It's kind of goes back to the 811 and awareness. So when you wanted to do something over there, we would send out one of our operators, you know, to ensure the safety of that pipeline while you complete your activities.
And when you're thinking, the other thing I want to mention too is you said about development, again, hinting back to that, why those conversations are really important with our land team. We also don't know where you're planning to do things, right? I have this 5 acres, I was going to build my dream home over there, we did the pond already, you know, those types of things. The middle school was always going to be here, you know, we bought the ground. That's the type of, that future growth, that future planning is not something that's on a public database anywhere. The only way we get access to that type of information is through conversations. So future plans for ground, that's something absolutely bring up as part of those conversations.
So I think it's really important for every landowner to realize that by granting an easement, you are limiting any future potential development for your farm. I mean, is that a true statement?
For the space of the 50 foot of the space of the easement, yes, which is why placement of it is really important.
And also, many of us don't know, if we would look back 30 years ago to the development that's occurred in O'Brien County, we would have never guessed we would have that. So you have to think long term. What about 20 years, 30 years down the line? You are giving away that potential for selling. Would that be correct?
The usage, the future usage of, yeah, as we
Right,
talked about, yes.
future
And that's why, you know, we're trying to collaboratively be part of that future thinking, but we don't know what we don't know. And so that's why I had, like I said before, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here over this, but that's why those conversations are so important.
Well, I agree about the conversation, but I don't know what's going to occur or what potential my land might have in 30 years.
Absolutely.
It has none today, but you know, who knows in 30 years. Another question, what research has been done to know that this CO2 that you're going to pump into Illinois, and is it going in limestone or what's it going into a mile and a half down?
Sure.
It's going into the...
So let me take this first, and then we'll go into more detail here about that. But so the area that's down there is effectively, I think of it kind of like lava rock for those of us who've done landscaping. It's actually filled with kind of a briny water. So think of a salty water that's about 3 times saltier than the ocean, that's then filled with effectively sand. And so what that liquid does is push out a little bit of that water, and then over time the carbon in the CO2 itself captures itself on those sand particles down there. It's not technically sand, but that's just how my mind looks at it, right? And over time that's how it captures and builds out. So similar to what we think of kind of like limestone.
So how do we know, I think someone mentioned 1,000 years it would be matter. How do we know that? Is there actually any scientific proof of that? And is there any scientific proof that by pressuring the CO2 now, we're going to do destruction to the existing nature?
So the destruction to the existing nature, so the CO2 we are capturing is excess CO2 from the environment, so it's not going to...
But I'm talking about in the
ground.
ground,
Okay.
a mile and a half down.
So,
You know, what impact, what studies do we have to say it will turn into matter and there will be no long-term damage?
so the Mount Simon Formation, a sandstone formation that is capped by a non-porous shale, is that cap rock that keeps it underground there. And the science is such that the carbon dioxide mineralizes into the rock over time.
And there has been studies done.
Yes, and there's
regarding
studies from the University of Iowa, Illinois. This formation that we're going into is very robustly studied for this purpose, and it is part of an existing sequestration project in existence already.
And part of that EPA permit, just to tack on a little bit more into that, so part of that Class 6 EPA permit that we're required to get as part of that for each individual well site does stipulate not only significant oversight about seismic activity, right? That's a common question whenever you think about putting something in the ground, right? Are we going to trigger an earthquake? That's something that they account for when they're looking at that, and so there are limits associated from a time period as well as a quantity of which goes into that space. Now, there's an abundance of space down there, we believe, based on their modeling, and there's additional monitoring wells as well. I think that's something I failed to mention earlier, but that really hard chart to read has one particular line where we're doing the injection, but then a couple other wells that are monitoring it as well to make sure that, again, it's staying where we put it. In addition to, and that's all part of that EPA monitoring, and is part of that permit, puts some boundaries on what can go down there and how much.
Okay. Thank you. One last comment or question, not sure if it's for the IUB or a Navigator. Why has there been opposition to releasing every landowner who is being impacted by this project? And granted, we would have to give our permission, but I think it would be helpful for us as landowners to know who's being impacted across the state of Iowa so that we may energize our efforts and see how we move forward. But it's my understanding Navigator has been opposed to that, and the Iowa Utilities Board also.
So we will follow with whatever is required of us by the IUB. I will let my colleague Monica here talk a little bit about how the landowner names and lists associated have been handled from a federal perspective too, that provides a little bit of precedent into this. But at the end of the day, we will follow with whatever is asked of us out of the Utilities Board as part of this process. So, Monica, sorry.
It's my understanding that it was simply stated it's too much work for the IUB or a Navigator to get a hold of, to put together a list of every landowner, yet each of us has gotten a letter, right? So I think there isn't a list, and I would agree, I would not want my name released without permission, but I think there should be a process where permission can be granted by the landowners so that we know who in fact is being impacted.
And I appreciate your comments in that regard. So it is a security issue, for your information that we're not going to share on your behalf. So there is federal and state precedent for that being confidential information. So it's not done to, keep up a screen or, try to prevent landowners gathering and discussing and communicating. That's not the effort. That's not the rationale. And we absolutely have that list. We've got these mailing lists for these purposes. So it's simply a personal security and information issue.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Thank you.
I have a question about your map over here that shows the green line, the dotted dashed blue line. What's your criteria for determining within that 50, half mile, where exactly the center of the pipeline is going to go? You say nothing is set yet. So, those of us that are maybe within the blue dotted line, the green line goes between two properties. This neighbor says, no way, I don't want that on my property. Does that mean you're going to push that onto my property? Or you're going to start doing research on who's got the better drain tile between the two properties? I mean, how do you know where in that half mile you're going to put the pipeline?
Very good question. I'm going to let.
And is it the squeaky wheel, the one that complains, that doesn't get it, and the other guy does?
I'm going to let my colleagues take that.
So, the reason we establish a corridor is because there's only so much detail we can get from available information. And so as we go through our due diligence and looking at all these parameters, we've got a wider corridor to reach out to get information, even to see if we pick the right location. Basically, the next step as our agents are contacting you guys for voluntary survey authorization, they're also going to ask for your feedback. What kind of tile, how many utilities do you have, and then what will follow is we'll have survey crews out there with subject matter experts kind of saying, is this area over here, or there's a house there, we need to get further away, as they kind of, come up with the optimized route when it comes to minimizing that impact from construction. It's where, if that's a more feasible way for construction, which minimizes the damage and the time on the property, that's taken into consideration. Is there a land use? There's a lot of parameters that we will have that we can't get until we get boots on the ground as well as feedback.
So why would I want to give you the voluntary, why would I want to say, go ahead and start the process without knowing what my neighbors are intending?
To voluntary survey.
Yeah. Right.
And so one of the things that, as we work, try to be good stewards, when it comes to, voluntary, survey, our agents will ask, is there certain timelines you want us on your property? Is there certain gates you want us to use? And so when we're reaching out to get that and that feedback, where in the unfortunate event that survey authorization is not voluntary, that's where the IUB, after these meetings, we would, we'd have to send certified mail notifications out to get that, ability to come out into your survey. Now, at Navigator, we don't want to just go straight, we have this meeting and then send certified, mail certificate to your property. We're looking at, following up after this meeting with all the landowners, asking, did you have any questions? Did you come to meetings? Here's some of the aspects of surveys, this is what it's going to look like, and trying to basically have that relationship before we just send a certified letter.
So is there any chance that half mile is going to shift?
It could.
So there'll be new property owners in this.
We're not.
So it can always shift. And so as we go through and do these assessments, if we get outside of that corridor, we'd have to have another meeting just like this if that final route gets outside of those blue dashed lines.
Do you see my concern that if I don't object, that means that I'm willing to have it, but my neighbor does? Do you see what I'm saying?
The survey for permission is not a foregone.
No, but I'm talking about
Get it.
filing, with the board, for instance. Comment or a complaint about not wanting this on my property. So if I don't say anything, you're gonna assume that, well, she's okay with that. So we're gonna locate it on her side of this half mile.
We don't assume anything. And so that's where, it's our burden, to come in and explain why we think this is where the pipeline should be. Here's the risks, here's the impacts,
Okay, one last question. I see the pipeline going potentially right next to a farmstead. What's your criteria for how far away from buildings it has to be?
That's what we're evaluating right now. But as we talked earlier about these theoretical plume sizes and all the other parameters, you know, the federal regulations has certain guidelines on their minimum. You know, as we've, you know, confirmed that we're going to meet and exceed all those, where some of these, you know, federal, you know, minimums are, you know, too close.
I assume you looked at that, the location of the farmstead before you.
And so what'll happen is, you know, and that's where this happened before, if we find it at the homestead, or if there's issues, we can move. And that's why it's a dynamic, and that's why you see a corridor, not a center line at this point.
Thank you.
Have signed an easement, you have signed it for life. And we have pipeline 3, Detroit pipelines are natural gas for our properties.
No.
And they're 50 to 60 years old, and every year and a half about, we've had them dig up on our property. They don't care what you're doing on that property time, they have a schedule, and they're gonna come when they wanna come. They don't care if they destroy the crop, they don't care if it's been 7 inches of rain, they're gonna go in on their schedule. And my husband tries to supervise this, and they really don't want him there. And the last time this happened, it happened in November, December. The crew went home to Oklahoma over this weekend. The hole filled with snow. They had some of their Hispanic workers dig it out by hand, the snow, so they can do the repair. And they asked my husband, you know who owns that property next door? And he says, yes, but we have, the smart pig told us we have to dig that out. So he went home and he called the person who owns it. He was not there, so he called his tenant. His tenant says, well, he's in Florida for the winter. So my husband calls the pipeline company, and he said, he isn't, I can tell you where so-and-so is. He's at the pipeline company, not the pipeline company per se, but who they contracted out to, said, well, we know, we have his obituary on our desk. That makes you really feel, now if you have children or grandchildren farming your land, someday they might say, what was Grandma and Grandma's thinking of when they gave that easement 50 years ago? That's about all I have to say, but we have not had very good luck, and there's 3 different pipeline companies, and they all have been sold 1 or 2 times, and they don't want to hear from you because they contracted another company to do the repair work. And when they do repair work, they pay you for the crop, but they do not pay for any damage to the land. And if you have a 1/4 of an acre at the back where the pipeline runs through, they're going to run from your driveway to that piece, destroying crop all the way. One time we had one who was supposed to go straight in, and that's where the hole was going to be dug. He veered off, he went to 4 varieties of test corn crop, came back because he was off, and they didn't want to pay us for that corn that destroyed. So we have not had good luck with pipeline companies. And when I talked to our lawyer lately, and he said, if you have given easement, and the pipeline company gets sued, and your name is probably going to be on there too, because you signed an easement, you have to defend yourself and pay for the attorney. Unless it's in the easement or contract that you don't have to have your own attorney. Now, I maybe you should say that I want everybody to know what they're in for when you sign this. And we didn't sign anything, they were done before we bought the land. My dad died, and there was an easement on his property for a windmill. He did not sign it. They got the wrong legal description, and it took us forever to get that easement off so that farm could be sold.
Yeah, can you describe what the facility will look like at each ethanol processing plant that will have to be engineered and built, that will capture the CO2, pressure it up to as much as 2,000 pounds, and then inject it into the pipeline?
Yes, I can try it. There's pictures it might be a better way of, we can post them up on our website, but from a high level visual of what it's going to look like, it would be taking, flotation stack that will basically come in, large ducting that will come to a series of compressors, scrubbers and compressors that are used every day and throughout, the U.S. for compressing the gas. As it comes to, the initial blower or compressor unit, it'll end up coming into an additional scrubbers and coolers, knocking out water. Then it'll go into a second set of compressor units. Then, as you get to a certain pressure, we'll run through a dehydration unit to basically ensure that the water content is well below where it should be. And then basically, that's where you start to get the last stage of going from a gas into a liquid on that last stage of a pump. Probably 2/3 of that equipment is in a building on the ethanol or fertilizers existing location.
Who engineers these kind of projects?
Several PhDs. We've got subject matter experts that have done this multiple times. There's some in service right now over in Decatur and throughout the U.S.
One other question. Suppose it's 2025 and you have your system completed and it's been tested and passed the pipeline and hazardous materials tests. How would you start up a project like this? Seems like you'd have to start it up one lateral line at a time, or would you do it all at once everywhere?
It would be a stage commissioning. Right now we're looking at building from Illinois out. And so as you get to certain aspects of it, you would basically do the post-construction assessments as well as a pre-commissioning plan, which would purge and you get that system ready for operation.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service.
I just want to ask you guys, the infrastructure fund, basically you're saying taxpayer money, correct? When you say the monies for this is in the infrastructure fund, the infrastructure fund is that taxpayer money? Whose money is it?
So are you referencing back to the earlier question about the
Right.
incentives that we talked through the infrastructure bill itself?
Well, you don't seem to know
Yes.
who really owns this gap over here.
Oh,
Who are the people that own this thing?
Sure.
And that stand to get rich using the taxpayers' money to do this thing would be my first question, and I know you're not going to answer that. And the engineers are gone, but are the people that are our supervisors. Gravel roads, if our county supervisors say you're born under every gravel road, that's what you're going to do. Okay, so they have control of that. When if you come through my field and I say I want this at 72 inches deep, it's my field. Do I get to dictate how deep you go?
Yes, and so that's part of the negotiation. And that's part of the incentives of doing it voluntarily instead of going through eminent domain.
I disagree with you about O'Brien County being a sweet spot. I think quite a few people would say that's not really a sweet spot, being the X there. But,
I think it's a pretty sweet, I don't know.
it is. It is. My other question, property taxes on this thing. O'Brien County gets a lot of property tax onto this, or is it?
I'm so on the cusp of being able to have an actual physical number to provide you that's specific to O'Brien County. I will have that very quickly. I've seen the spreadsheet, I just don't have all the counties memorized.
But so you're not centrally assessed?
Yes, so it'd be centrally assessed, but then it's remitted back to the county based on the footprint of the project.
Okay, so more of the tax money goes somewhere else than O'Brien County?
It's centrally assessed by the state, but then they give it back to the county for delegation, yes.
And you said that the release of CO2 really doesn't hurt anything, it just goes into the atmosphere. What about people that are close to it though? I think we touched on that a little bit, but how close can you be to this cloud?
So, when it comes to, there's OSHA guidelines, and that's where, I would say there's a set distance that is safe. There's certain limits that are safe, and there's certain equipment in order to detect what is that safe, distance and air quality. But that's part of our jobs as we continue to develop, the different systems and what size, because really what it comes down to is, there's theoretical and there's practical. And so what one person says safe, what the federal government says safe, it's working with emergency responders here. you get, what is everybody, what does a landowner think, what is a firefighter, what does an EMT? It's basically feedback from everyone, where there's certain guidelines on, from OSHA, but that's just a standard. We can meet and exceed that to make it a more safe, environment for everyone.
So, this must be within a quarter of a mile of my house. If this thing did rupture, would you want your family there?
I would have no problems.
Interesting.
I think another piece that we mentioned earlier is putting in those valves, as Steve mentioned earlier, based on the unique circumstances and the unique footprint of each segment of the line. So there's not a de facto that says X number is safe and it's safe everywhere. We want to take into account that in this place you may be a little bit closer, in the next place they're a little bit further, and so you space those valves out that allow for quick response of being able to shut down the system in the unfortunate event that something like that does happen. So again, taking into account unique circumstances throughout the full footprint of it.
Just kind of go back to the first question. If it wasn't for the federal tax money going into this thing, no way. These private investors that stand to get rich out of this thing would never put their money in it if it wasn't backed by the government. This would never happen without taxpayer money.
The federal incentives are yes,
Huge, right?
Huge to drive not only projects like this, but projects all over the country that are looking at decarbonization. But I draw your attention to, bear with me, that was only one of those particular stipulations that are up there, right? We have the federal tax credit, you have state-based programs like the LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard, that's a market driver for driving down the carbon intensity of fuel. They are paying a premium for lower carbon intensity fuel. If our local processors want to meet that demand, there has to be processes in place to be able to meet that. And then thirdly, as I mentioned, the voluntary carbon credit markets that are out there as well. So you are right, that federal stimulus is
That's all rigged market by government regulation also.
helping drive some of the activity,
But that's creating the demand for the customers. We, as Navigator, are not taking the federal subsidies or the tax credits. And so it is creating that demand for our customers who have reached out to us to come up with a solution.
Okay. Not really a question for you, but I've got a couple engineers in the family that say, in what world do they think pumping this carbon into the ground is a solution? But that's just their opinion. And my last question will be for you guys. Are you the three people that are the Iowa Utility Board, all three of you, or who?
No, none of us are on the board.
There's only three people on that board though, right?
Yes, sir.
And two of them probably have some background and interest in seeing this project succeed, right? Friends of Branstad's and friends of, there's a lot going on back here about these people whose names won't be named, it seems like. But this will be my question for you, if you can answer it. There's no way this project can happen without eminent domain. Have you ever seen a pipeline happen without eminent domain?
I'm not going to speculate as to whether the project is going to request eminent domain.
No. Okay, my question, I don't care what they're going to do. Have you ever seen a project like this succeed without eminent domain?
I have not been at the board when one of these projects has gone through, so I have not seen any of these go through yet while my time at the board.
You guys should all be politicians.
Hello, my name is Craig Kruger. I'm the plant manager at the Blair plant in Hartley, Iowa. And I just want to say a few words. I guess first of all, it's been a great relationship. Blair bought the plant back in 2009, and it's been excellent between the community of Hartley and O'Brien County and us. So I just want to thank everyone for that. And just a couple other things with Valero. So the thing I appreciate about the company is how much we give back to the community. Over the last few years, we've given to United Way and to local agencies at least over $100,000 every year. So it's something I appreciate about the company. And how we impact you guys in here, obviously, is on the corn side of things. So we consume 140,000 bushels a day, which is about 50 million bushels per year. So a pretty large corn consumer. And so my folks farm over by Little Rock, my wife's folks by George, and I just know how the ethanol industry has really changed farming over the past, or the price of corn over the past few years anyways. So the big thing I guess I just want to share on this project from my standpoint is it's extremely important from our point in the ethanol industry to stay competitive. So if you look at North Dakota, they can already sequester carbon straight into the ground where they're at. Illinois has the geology. Eastern plants, Eastern Corn Belt, they're going to have the geology, so they won't require the pipeline like Iowa does. So unfortunately, we just don't have the pipeline or the geology here that wouldn't require a pipeline. But without it, I can tell you that our plant in Hartley will not be competitive, and it'll be very, very difficult to continue to compete with those plants that do have this. So this is a pretty important project, obviously, to our plant and to our community to keep the plant running and at full capacity. And so I just want to share a few of those comments. So thank you.
Hi, I would like to start this by saying that my parents are also impacted by this project as landowners. So that is my interest in being here today. And I'd like to thank the Valero person from talking. I'm not going to put him on the spot with my exact questions, but I think what I have seen on the Valero's website, as backed up by his statement, is that plant is operating at max capacity. That is my interpretation of the public information put out there by Valero. So one of the questions that I haven't been able to answer and just trying to understand this project is if your current facilities are operating at max capacity, how are you going to impact the corn market without building more infrastructure, more plants? I don't know. It's hard to understand how this is going to impact people if you're already at max capacity, which if you look at the Valero plants on this line, they all seem to be at max capacity.
Very good question. And so when you're looking at valuation, there's kind of two factors that go into that, and I'll make a correlation back to those of us that grow crops. We generally want higher yields and higher prices. We'd like one or the other too, but it's nice to have both. So having increased operations, so yes, it's at full capacity, those do range throughout the year, but this project not only ensures that that plant can continue to stay at full nameplate capacity or sometimes above that, but also then the profitability of each of those gallons coming out of the plant has the potential to grow. So in essence, increasing the price or the valuation of what's coming out of that facility as well, which then should have a trickle down onto the valuation of feedstocks coming in.
It's difficult sometimes to look at some of those statements and understand, are we increasing the profitability for Valero, which is a publicly traded company, or is that a trickle-down impact to the farmer when the facility is already at max capacity? So, for example, when Valero announced this project, they publicly stated that this is going to increase their profit margins, right? So that means Valero is saving money, reducing costs. So I just want to point that out as everybody's assessing the trickle-down effects of this to really think broadly. Are these facilities privately owned and the profit's going to be private, or are any of these public? We have co-ops for a reason, and a lot of these customers are going to be privately owned with the private profits. I don't think anybody is going to ask a big oil company to share in the profits, because we all know how that works. Second question I have is, for the uses of CO2, is it true that CO2 is used in veterinary offices and slaughterhouses to euthanize animals?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Is the entity that you are representing today the entity that owns or will own the proposed sequestration site in Illinois? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Is it true that you have not filed for your EPA permit or publicly announced that location for the sequestration of this today?
That's correct. We are still so early in the stages of this. We have identified the spot on the map, and I believe it's indicated on the project-wide map over here. We are looking at Christian County, Illinois, which is right in the midst of that Mount Simon formation.
Okay. How long do you anticipate that permitting and then the construction process will take in Illinois?
The EPA well permit?
Yes.
So we're drafting that application now. I believe it's a year plus to get that permit and 6 months or less to construct.
Okay, so you're saying within 2 years you expect to roughly have that site constructed, operational, permitted?
Yes, it won't be operational until we have the pipeline component feeding it, supplying it.
Okay, yeah, that's true. I ask because anecdotally I've read that it can take 6 years for a sequestration site to be permitted. So when I look at the materials that you sent my family, it looks like the pipeline will be operational based on what you sent out to landowners, potentially a couple years in advance of when that site's operational.
So the 6-year comment of kind of historical permitting of Class 6 well permits doesn't surprise me. The office within the EPA that oversees these, there hasn't been that many of them. Part of what was funded, I believe in the infrastructure bill, and if it's not there, it's in the other, the reconciliation bill that we talked about a little bit earlier in your questioning, additional funding for the agency to staff up that particular office within the EPA that oversees that permitting process, to make sure that they have additional man hours and capacity to be able to evaluate and look through those permits, and hopefully get an more efficient time frame.
And part of that is also, again, the Mount Simon formation, not too far county or too over from where we are, is an operational CCS in the same formation. So that it's not they don't have to start from zero in the review process. They've got information that they've already reviewed and understand.
Okay. What is the anticipated, you guys say, I think it's metric tons flow on an annual basis of this pipeline? Technologically speaking, I guess it's versus
we say expandable up to 15 million metric ton annually. Just knowing that we want expansion room within the line to potentially bring on additional customers as we move forward.
So how much can go into that proposed site in Illinois on an annual basis?
So the site we'd be permitting for, we would propose its volume, which we would be subject to there. There's room for expansion there as well. So the amount of capacity we're taking up in that formation is minuscule compared to the capacity that's available.
The proven capacity is billions of metric tons in the Mount Simon formation. And so it's like a pebble in a bathtub with this current sequestration capacity that we're looking at.
And is the determination of whether the carbon goes into that site based on the customer's preference in the pipeline? Or if an oil company wants to use this, instead of putting it in the ground in Illinois in an oil well elsewhere, is that at their decisioning? You're just transporting it and they do whatever they want with it?
As part of what goes into our line, we are tasked with transporting it for permanent storage and sequestration at that site. So anything that interacts with our project would be permanently stored and sequestered.
Will any customers be transmitting on your common carrier to not put in that site?
No.
No.
So everything's going in the ground in Illinois?
Yes.
If you want to holler, we can repeat that.
Whose idea is this pipeline? Who brought that up in the first place? And why do we need it?
He asked whose idea was the pipeline and why we need it.
Very good question. So we, as we mentioned a little bit before that, we're the transportation entity for our customers. So the ethanol facilities, the fertilizer plants that have come to us and said, we can't do this absent a means of transportation. So our entities that we are working with, this is providing that value that they have asked for to be able to increase the value of the products that they have at their facilities, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, sir? I want to make sure I...
Well, original idea was, is this the Green New Deal? Is that part of this or what?
No, there isn't some political driver that's saying this is the golden key to solving all of, particular problems. This is a project that has been proposed as part of a conduit to providing value. The customers came to us asking to provide the value, to provide that connection point for these types of activities. We do believe that, forward-looking, just as I mentioned before, right, technologies continue to improve, products get better, innovation, right? So in order to allow the ethanol fertilizer, a lot of our processors to continue to evolve and innovate, we do believe that CCS, so technologies like this, are probably going to become standard operating procedure, that the ethanol production process will necessarily likely involve carbon capture as part of that production process, so it will become part of the standard process.
When did they first decide it was bad? I mean, ethanol has been going on for a number of years.
And I don't, to say that it's bad, I think is probably a little bit of an overstatement. There's just opportunities for improvement, opportunities to gain some of that carbon back that otherwise is being emitting. Much like if you think back to, initially when ethanol came out, we didn't have centrifuges to spin off the corn oil. Now many of the plants are spinning off corn oil off of the DDGs and selling that into another value-added sector. What plants were initially built for, to provide the fuel, now has become a plethora of valuable byproducts coming out of those facilities. It's not just one particular thing. You're smiling. But there is a lot that comes out of those facilities that now adds value to it. This is adding value to that CO2, which is one of those byproducts.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
With technology improving every year, are you aware of any studies that have been done where they could have captured this carbon right at the ethanol plants rather than doing this pipeline?
There are places that are doing that have that requisite geology. So facilities that sit on top of areas that have this cross-section underneath of them are doing that. ADM is an example of that. They have that there in Decatur to be able to do some of that on site.
So basically, you're in it for the tax credits.
We are in it to provide that conduit because facility here in Hartley can't just drill a well here in town and inject it here. It doesn't work. There has to be a connection point to be able to get that product to a place where it can be injected. It just can't happen here.
But I guess I would think instead of putting it in the ground, these coal-fired power plants try to clean up their emissions and stuff. I would think that there would be some technology out there to capture the carbon right at the ethanol plants, not necessarily put it into the ground.
It is being captured, but once it's captured, to not release it back into the environment or into the atmosphere, you need to do something with that.
Are these tax credits perpetual as long as the pipeline's functioning?
They're not.
Speaking the particular federal tax credit you're talking to, as with most tax policy, there is a sunset. That's good tax policies to have a sunset on programs. So they aren't in perpetuity. But again, I bring that back to the model that we have. Any of those tax credits, any of those incentives associated with these projects, stay with that facility.
Thank you.
Stay with the privately owned facility. Just to follow up to that, so my local ethanol plant does do some capture of CO2. I don't know how much, that's private information. Perhaps the representatives of your ethanol plant can say that, but they do capture some part of CO2 and they do sell it. So it is a marketable good. It's used in industrial manufacturing. As I said earlier, slaughterhouses also use it to euthanize animals. So there's a market for it. It also goes into soda pop, things like that. But that's a good question for your local facilities because it's my understanding, and I've heard from people that work for my local plant, that they already capture some amount of it and they do sell it already, independent of this pipeline.
That is absolutely correct.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, IUB staff will leave upon the conclusion of your questions, and it appears we have reached that point. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay. I checked my checklist and have determined that all of the required information has been presented by Navigator. As landowners, you have the right to ask Navigator to address your concerns through changes to the route or to make other changes. The negotiation process is the time to request such changes, and to address any concerns you might have. It is usually helpful to be specific with your request or concern. The requirements of Iowa Code Chapter 479B have been satisfied by the presentation and discussion completed here. Navigator may now begin negotiation with landowners for easements or other property interests for this project located in this county. This meeting is adjourned.
And we do have our land team over here on the side, so those that are interested in specific parcel information, I'd encourage you to stop at that table before leaving today. Thank you so much.